Hey guys, Jin here. This is a charge bolt build for the end of Season 3, and as usual it kills Lilith, kills bosses, kills other demons and does T100s and all that jazz, so give it a shot. If you like these kind of build guides and want more of them in the future, please like, subscribe and hit the bell, as it really helps out a lot. Now let's get to the build. So we're going to take 2 into Firebolt, then go down to our core skills, 2 into Devastation, and 3 into Elemental Dominance. Then we're going to take 1 into Chain Lightning, and go for Destructive Chain Lightning. Then we're going to take 5 into Charge Bolts, and go for Greater Charge Bolts. In our defensive skills, we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, 5 into Teleport, and go for Shimmering Teleport. We're going to take 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Ice Armor, for Mystical Ice Armor, and 1 into Elemental Attunement. Then in our Conjuration skills, we're going to take 1 into Ice Blades, 1 into Align the Elements, for the 3 in Mana Shield, and 3 in Protection. In our Mastery skills, we're going to take 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blades. We're also going to take 1 into Static Discharge, and 3 into Invigorating Conduit. Then our ultimate skills, we're going to take 1 into Unstable Currents, and go for Prime Unstable Currents, not taking Supreme. Then 1 into Coursing Currents, 3 into Electrocution, and 3 into Convulsions. And for our key passive, we're taking Veer's Mastery. That pretty much wraps it up for the skill tree. Now for the Paragon Board. So for the starting board, we're going to take Tactician, and that's going to give us an extra 125% bonus to all rare nodes, but also we gain 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. For our second board, it's going to be the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to put in the Destruction glyph here for all the extra critical strike damage, as well as having crits increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. Our third board, we're going to take the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Elementalist glyph. So again, we get the extra Paragon nodes within range, gain 75% bonus to their non-physical damage and damage reduction modifiers. Also, dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, and that will stack once per element. For our fourth board, we're going to be taking the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to be putting in the Territorial glyph here for a lot of extra damage to close enemies, as well as gaining 15% damage reduction against close enemies. Our fifth board is going to be Static Surge, and we're going to take the legendary node here. As for the glyph, we're putting in Flame Feeder for the extra damage to burning enemies, as well as dealing 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. For our sixth board, we're taking the Frigid Fate board, also taking the legendary node. For the glyph, we're using Enchanter, so that's going to give us a load of non-physical damage. For our seventh board, we're taking the Searing Heat board, and we're going to put in the Exploit glyph. That's going to give us a lot of vulnerable damage, as well as dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy. We'll increase our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 10%. And finally, our eighth board is going to be the Elemental Summoner board, and we're going to put in the Charged glyph here. We get a bit of extra Crackling Energy damage, but picking up Crackling Energy will also grant us 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, up to 15%. So that's pretty much it for the Paragon board. If I went too fast for you, don't forget to check out the build planner in the description below, and everything's going to be in there: the skill tree, Paragon board, glyphs, the construct, and all of the gear of course. So have a look at that to go at your own pace. Next up we have the enchantments. So for our first enchantment, we're going to have Chain Lightning. So Chain Lightning forms automatically after spending 100 mana, but also when Chain Lightning critically strikes, it has a 30% chance to form the Crackling Energy. And our second enchantment, we're going to go for the Firebolt. So direct damage from skills applies additional burning damage over 8 seconds, and we're going to use that to proc our Flame Feeder glyph, as well as getting the bonuses from Devouring Blaze. Next up we have the Seneschal construct. We're going to be using Tempest as our first Governing Stone. We're going to be using Breaking support, Efficiency support, and Arcing support. If you're having resource issues, then you can change Arcing support for Resource support. For our second Governing Stone, we're going to be using Flash of Adrenaline, and we'll be putting in Tactical support, Duration support, and Initiative support. If you happen to have Evernight, you could swap that with Arcing support, and if you have Genesis, you could swap that with Initiative support. So next up, the gear. So for the gear, I'll be listing the affixes you want on the left side of the screen from best to worst, and let's get into it. Starting with the helm, you're going to look for something with total armor percent, cooldown reduction, max mana, and intelligence. If you can't find those, then look for max life and all stats. As for the aspect, you're going to be using Disobedience here to gain that increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage. If you're fighting bosses, then you could use the Godslayer crown, that will give you a lot of extra damage, as well as the unique aspect, which is a whole load of damage. If you have a Harlequin crest, you would use that instead. For the chest piece, we're going to look for a Raiment of the Infinite. That's going to give us a lot of close damage, damage to stunned, ranks into glass cannon, and the unique aspect which causes teleport to pull in close enemies and stun them for 2 to 3 seconds. This will increase the cooldown of teleport by 20%. If you don't have access to the Raiment, then you would use a chest piece with total armor percent, damage reduction against burning, damage reduction against close, and damage reduction against distant. If you can't get those, then just look for damage reduction, max life, or intelligence. And as for the aspect, you would use something like Mage-Lords here, so the Veer's Mastery key passive will also grant 6 to 9% damage reduction for each close enemy, up to 18 to 27%. Next up, we have the gloves. We're going to look for gloves with crit chance, ranks into charge bolt, attack speed, and lightning crit damage. If you can't get those, then look for intelligence, lucky hit, or all stats. As for the aspect, we'll be using the piercing static aspect, so charge bolts will pierce, but deal 60 to 40% less damage to targets after the first. Next up we have the legs. We're going to go for Tybalt's Will here, that's going to give us a bunch of extra damage, maximum resource, potion capacity, and some damage reduction from close enemies as well. But more importantly, we get the unique aspect, dealing 20 to 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. Also, when we become unstoppable, we gain 50 of our primary resource, so that's really handy here, both for the damage boost and for the resource. If you don't have Tybalt's Will, you would just use defensive pants with total armor percent, damage reduction from burning, damage reduction from distant, and damage reduction from close. If you can't get those, look for normal damage reduction, or damage reduction against injured. As for the aspect, you would use Everliving, so you take 20 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Next up we have the boots. We're going to be using Flicker Step, and that's going to give us some movement speed, all stats, ultimate skill damage, and damage reduction from close enemies. But more importantly, we're using it for the aspect here. Each enemy we evade through reduces our active ultimate cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds, up to 10 seconds per evade. So using that efficiently is going to be what enables you to keep your ultimate unstable currents running pretty much the whole time you're fighting. If you don't have access to Flicker Step, then you would use boots with movement speed, teleport, mana cost reduction, and intelligence. If you can't get those, go for all stats or flame shield ranks. As for the aspect, you would use Ghostwalkers, so while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% movement speed, and can move freely through enemies. Next up we have the Amulet, and we're going to be looking for something with total armor percent, mana cost reduction, cooldown reduction, and ranks into Devouring Blaze or Elemental Dominance. If you can't get those, then look for movement speed or any of the damage reductions. As for the aspect, we're going to use Elementalist here, so our core or mastery skills cast at or above 100 mana gain 30 to 60% increased crit strike chance depending on your roll. This will bring our critical strike chance up to almost 100% with this build if you get a max roll. Next, for the rings, we're going to be using the Ring of Starless Skies here. That gives you critical strike chance, critical strike damage, core skill damage, and lucky hit chance. But also, spending primary resource reduces the resource cost of our skills and increases our damage by 10% for 3 seconds, up to 40%, so that will stack 4 times, and once you've stacked it up, it will basically just keep refreshing whenever you spend primary resource. For our second ring, we'll be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop for a bunch of non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource generation and cooldown reduction, and also for the awesome unique aspect. For each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, and any elemental damage we deal will keep refreshing all of the bonuses. So basically we will have 3 stacks, which will give us 30 to 45% increased damage. If you don't have access to either of these rings, you would look for a ring with crit chance, resource generation, crit damage, and max mana. If you can't get those, then damage to vulnerable or damage to close are good. And as for the aspects, you would want to be using the Prodigy's aspect on the first ring, so that will restore 15 to 25 mana when you use a cooldown. And on the second ring you could use Umbral to restore 1 to 4 of your primary resource whenever you CC an enemy. If you don't need Umbral because you think your mana is good, then you would use something else, probably Conceited, so deal 15 to 25% increased damage while you have a barrier. Another option, especially if you're only fighting bosses, would be Swell. That will enable you to deal 21 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier. And you would probably put this on the second ring, or onto the gloves, replacing piercing static for those boss fights. Last but not least, we have the Staff of Lamb Esen as our weapon. It's going to give us critical strike damage, lightning damage, damage to close, and 5% chance to restore primary resource on lucky hit. Also, your casts of Charge Bolt have 40 to 60% chance to be attracted to enemies and will last 300% longer. So this is really helpful and probably the biggest part of the build. I wouldn't really recommend changing to Charge Bolt without this. So as such, I'm not going to list any backup weapons. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, you're going to be using skulls in the jewelry, rubies in the armor, and emeralds in the weapon, which I forgot to do once again. So that pretty much wraps it up for the guide. Thanks a lot for watching. If you did enjoy the guide, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell as it helps out a lot in growing the channel. I would really appreciate it. So thanks a lot, and this will probably be my last video before Season 4 comes out, as that's right around the corner. So until then, enjoy your Diabloing. Bye!